Comparing Dehumanization in Nazi Germany to alt-right U.S. social media narratives. A final Capstone project by James Dietrich. It is undeniable that dehumanization through propaganda was a tool during the Nazi regime that ultimately proved effective in augmenting the public perception to view Jewish people negatively or, if not, with indifference. To reach that juncture, the Nazis depicted Jews and other minorities as subhuman, including the use of metaphors such as parasites or vermin, racial slurs, and images that presented them as threats to society. The propaganda minister of the Nazi regime, Joseph Goebbels, emphasizes this narrative in his diary, where he states, "The sufferings of the Russian people under Bolshevism are indescribable. This Jewish terrorism must be radically eliminated from all of Europe. That is our historic task." More recently, I hypothesized that during political flashpoints such as the 2016 and 2020 election years, social media has fostered an environment on numerous occasions when racial slurs, conspiracy theories, and negative stereotypes circulated with ease on platforms like Twitter, which is now X, Reddit, and 4chan. For more context, President-elect Donald J. Trump himself has also been quoted saying,
"We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country."
Some other examples of dehumanization include calling immigrants invaders and illegals, or shortcutting the definition of minorities to criminals as a threat to national security. For example, these two posts from X highlight some of these blatant generalizations. The one on the right specifically, more so, hauntingly resembles the Nazi eugenics theory, stating, "It costs more for the upkeep of illegals than it will cost to deport them." Now, while this comparison is a very strong accusation that suggests a possible resurgence of the fascist and far-right ideologies that led to the onslaught of a world war, this may not be the case. Thus, it is important to flesh out the definitions and applications of hate versus racism in the context of both Nazi Germany and the online far-right political realms of the United States, which leads us to my question. How do the dehumanizing techniques used in Nazi propaganda compare to modern hate speech on social media, amplified by the far right in the United States, and what are the impacts of these parallels on fostering division and violence? To answer this, I will apply a methodology wherein there are four aspects that I seek to uncover. 1. Defining hate versus racism in Nazi Germany and recent online U.S. narratives. 2. The similarities and differences in the Nazi state's portrayal of the enemy compared to portrayals in far-right dimensions on social media in the U.S. 3. Examining what both U.S. far-right media narratives and Nazi propaganda seek to achieve, plus determining whether vilification is the primary objective. And 4. Exploring if dehumanization through propaganda is applicable to just the Nazis, the far-right U.S. social media narratives, or is it really timeless? Hate is an intense emotional response associated with feelings of extreme dislike, anger, or hostility towards a person, group, object, or an idea. Thus, it is subjective in nature and can be triggered by many different things, ranging from personal experiences to deeply ingrained beliefs or biases. In today's society, we can see hate manifest itself in various ways, such as verbal insults, exclusion, violence, or especially harmful behaviors directed towards the object of such hate. Therefore, hate can be a product of racism, but they are different. Racism is always a systemic, structural, or institutionalized form of prejudice or discrimination based on race. Racism goes beyond the personal feelings like hate to incorporate power dynamics that privilege one racial group, often the dominant or majority, over others, which is most commonly the minority. Racism in itself can be both an ideology and a practice, and we often see it operate through policies, societal norms, institutions, and cultural assumptions that systematically disadvantage marginalized racial groups. The Jim Crow laws in the United States are a key example of this. In the context of Nazi Germany, a similar set of racist policies were the Nuremberg laws that barred Jews from rights like interracial marriage as well as citizenship, considering the law defined citizens as those who are of German or related blood, completely ousting Jews from what the Nazis deemed as German society and heritage. Where hate came into play was through the Nazis' propaganda machine, orchestrated by the government. What is crucial to remember here is that the Nazi press was an arm of the state that saw only printing and releasing of what the government saw fit, compared to the United States, where the press and media have an unannounced obligation to uphold and report the truth, even when it is against the government. That is by far the most important difference between Nazi Germany and the United States. Specifically in far-right ideologies in the U.S. during Donald Trump's presidency and associated events like the election years, one would expect a rise in hate speech or white nationalist language, but that was not the case, especially on pertinent social media platforms like Reddit, where that kind of rhetoric culminates. This leads us to our first conclusion and difference between the two nations. The Nazi government was entirely responsible for providing the biases and beliefs that ingrained hate in its population through racist policies like the Nuremberg laws. As a result, hate events like Kristallnacht easily propagated themselves, compared to the online realm of the United States, where studies find that rather it is the offline events like protests and elections that trigger an increase in online hate speech and racism unrelated to the event itself, clearly displaying an emotional response rather than a factual or systematic one. But what is similar, however, is that the Jews are the primary target of hate speech, followed by black people and then political opponents in those far-right United States online narratives. The primary instances in which the Jews were mentioned were often rooted in disinformation as well as conspiracy theories, reflecting the prevalence of both white supremacist and National Socialist ideologies in those alt-right communities. Chapter 2. Nazi Codification versus U.S. Social Media Narratives. Herein, the objective is to compare the codification and portrayal of Nazi propaganda with narratives on far-right U.S. social media. I think it's important to start with the fact that this project was written, edited, and uploaded nearly 80 years after the events of the Holocaust, and in it I tried to draw comparisons between two completely different politically structured states. So I find it crucial here to emphasize as to why such references to that genocide are necessary. By looking back at the Holocaust, it illustrates the strain of toxic ideals, especially with its focus on the body politic in Nazi Germany and its attempt in establishing an Aryan utopia that the Nazis deemed was under an inevitable threat from the Jewish population. That narrative of fear specifically, instilled in Germans' minds for years prior that stem from misguided racial sciences, is exactly what prompted the codification of such policies like the Nuremberg laws, and simultaneously the exportation of hate from Goebbels' propaganda ministry. Now, returning to the purpose of comparisons in this project, it is only a mere hypothetical what could have been different had the Nazis incorporated the viral nature of social media to boost their own rhetoric. Rather than any direct codifications of racist laws and institutionalized hate in today's American political realm, we instead see online calls for exclusionary policies and violence, bolstered by the algorithms written in the scripts of social media websites. These types of posts and forums rope in numerous users by the ever-growing echo chambers that regurgitate the same rhetoric, an algorithm not intended to stir hatred, but rather capitalize on keeping users online, which in turn allows for more time for the users to be exposed to advertisements, the primary method of income for free social media platforms. Moving forward onto the vilification of those depicted in Nazi propaganda, the topic of dehumanization remains as the frontrunner in its narrative. A central idea in both Nazi officials and their reports was to equate Jews to diseases that infect Germany's national body, or in translation, the Volkskörper. This widespread dehumanization, whether being consumed directly through the propaganda or indirectly, definitely radicalized the German population to either reach a point of mutual hatred towards those vilified populations, or, if not, complete indifference. Unsurprisingly, online alt-right groups utilize platforms like social media since they are easy to radicalize and facilitate recruitment among new users. In looking at examples that vilify Jews, the rhetoric being used is almost always derogatory and falls back on the ideologies of white supremacy. For example, on the social media platform 4chan, one user states, "Be quiet, Jew. I knew you'd see that my reply because you need the Goyim to worship your Jewish God of Israel." Another user responds and says, "Agreed, they are the most sinister and evil, but even religions without a persecution complex like Buddhism have dogmatic cultish beliefs and is not suitable for white people. Leave that shit for Asians and Jeets." It is very important to note here that oftentimes when flagged content that includes hate speech on more rigidly moderated social media platforms, unlike 4chan, it is most likely to occur when the background information prompting such rhetoric is entirely false. Therefore, as a free platform, social media sites differ in how those vilified are actually dehumanized in the context of Nazi Germany and the United States. But considering the precursors that led to one of the worst genocides in human history, however, it is still a very fearful prospect if there is a political objective established in the U.S. and codified into law, especially one that is rooted in institutionalizing hatred. But there is a distinction. Under a totalitarian dictatorship wherein all the functions of the government are controlled by the state, false information based on events did not matter in the case of the Nazis, where they had the luxury of controlling what they wanted the public to hear. On the other hand, there is a safeguard written in the Bill of Rights that allows the press in the United States to hold the government accountable and report on events of their choosing, clarifying as to why such vilifying hate speech examples are almost always rooted in misinformation. Chapter 3. What are the primary objectives? In this chapter, I will examine the deeper goals behind both Nazi propaganda and modern far-right online hate speech. Going back to when Hitler was making his preparations to start the Second World War, in a speech to the Reichstag, the building of the German parliament, he threatened to exterminate all the Jews in Europe if they provoked such a war. Using the Jews here to justify the actions of the Nazi Party as well as his own, this would become a major objective, achieved by dehumanizing and scapegoating the Jewish people. To reach this juncture at which the public either agreed or became indifferent to Hitler's intentions, it took the Nazis years of strategic framing. It began with the theory of eugenics, which was already a prominent one in the years leading up to the Nazi regime. In other words, it was an already weak dam, and the Nazis ran away with it. Upon gaining power in the Reichstag, the Nazis began implementing narratives that highlighted the negative impacts of, quote, undesirables on German society, specifically the mentally ill and handicapped. It wouldn't take long before the Nazis experimented with euthanizing such peoples and broadened the narrative to fit Jews as a plague on German society, all in search of a perfect German utopia. Knowing that U.S. alt-right rhetoric shares some of these ideals like white supremacy and anti-Semitism, it leads us to a question. Is the goal of alt-right social media to achieve some kind of political gain? The short answer is no, and in fact, empirical research points to that even in text-only online spaces, people will go online not in search of some disembodied libertarian utopia, but to engage in the construction and affirmation of embodied racial identities, which are in turn shaped by power relations, those power relations being the ways in which people with power or societal status interact with those without it. Those same power relations can directly attribute themselves to societal biases, which, as mentioned earlier, can fuel hatred. In both instances, dehumanization and vilification of certain groups can sow division in a society, fostering an environment that will only widen the gap between them and expose their differences. In conjunction with this division, scapegoating is also one aspect, and arguably the most prevalent in both the cases of Nazi Germany and the United States. To put it briefly, a common scapegoating theme in the U.S. is the portrayal of illegal immigrants as those who, quote, steal American jobs, which results in economic issues for actual American citizens. On the other hand, Nazis regularly denounced the Jews as creating the faults in German society, including economic hardship. This scapegoating would go even further and attest to German military failures, such as the failed capture of the Soviet city Stalingrad, where the narrative evolved from previous destructive Bolshevism to international Jewry. If there is one thing to take away from this project, it is that division can create opportunities, specifically ones that political figures can grasp onto to rally support for themselves. For example, it is pretty doubtful that a politician might search for actual solutions among their groups of online supporters, and thus by utilizing either both radical right or left groups, it can rather become an effort to rope in a greater following, by taking advantage of the online echo chambers, whose complex networks through their users can tap into wider online dimensions. Regarding a more personal objective of division and dehumanization, we have also seen characters like Alex Jones and his creation InfoWars capitalize on this division for financial gain. Aligning with pro-gun and anti-government rhetoric, Alex Jones stated that the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in 2012 that killed 28 was a hoax. Jones argued that the deaths were staged as a part of a government plot to push anti-gun rhetoric, resulting in the seizure of guns from Americans. Many plaintiffs in a defamation case against Jones to this day argue that he has cashed in profits for years from his lies about the massacre. Thus, while objectives of dehumanization in Nazi propaganda are merely for achieving political aspirations, alt-right social media in the United States has the luxury of freedom of speech and free accessibility, providing political leaders with opportunities to gain more support, users to spread alt-right rhetoric to garner financial profits, and internationally sow division that alter power relations between racial groups. Chapter 4. Is dehumanization timeless? My objective here is to explore whether dehumanization is unique to specific contexts or a reoccurring tactic throughout history. Now, based on strictly the previous example to explore in this project, I can conclude that dehumanization itself is timeless. Pertaining to both the cases of Nazi Germany and alt-right media narratives, we now have seen the presence and evolution of both anti-Semitic and white supremacist rhetoric, as well as their usages. What differs is their dissemination. Obviously, the internet was not invented at the time of the Nazis, but it did not stop the regime from broadcasting over the radio, holding rallies and speeches, creating propaganda posters, and implementing racist policies. It's also crucial to remember that dehumanization does not just occur in wartime, a point emphasized by Nick Haslam, an expert in psychology. He adds that it's happening right here, right now, and every day good people who don't see themselves as being prejudiced bigots are nevertheless falling prey to it, showing the ease at which such extreme ideas like those on social media platforms are to encapsulate oneself with. Another example of dehumanization outside of wartime is the Rwandan genocide, where much of the radicalization that fueled hatred stemmed from Hutu radio broadcasts calling Tutsis cockroaches. It is with that example that it becomes critical to understand the mechanisms of dehumanization, specifically that it evolves with technology. The obvious hypothetical is that of Nazi Germany with the ability to post on social media. But more intrinsically, dehumanization will always follow with the toils of ethnic groups and will almost always be reinforced by racial stereotypes. A key example in the United States is the comparison of African Americans to apes. Considering these blatant acts of dehumanization online, one narrative argues that social media represents a threat to democracy and civility. But I want to offer a bit of pushback against this. Therefore, I conclude that while dehumanization itself is timeless, its dissemination methods are constantly changing. That being said, with the free accessibility of social media, the radical ideas in the alt-right dimensions can be rivaled, if they are not snuffed out already by moderators, then by other users. It is not always an act of fighting fire with fire, I must say, but utilizing the algorithms provided by these social media platforms to spread unbiased information and opposing ideas. Now that we've reached the conclusion, I want to open with by saying that Nazi Germany and the United States were not once only foes, but are two vastly different nations in the realm of politics and society. Yet, narratives like anti-Semitism and white supremacy propagated by the Nazis exist extensively in alt-right social media realms in the United States. A comparison like this is definitely a fearful one, and thus it has been crucial to flesh out the differences and similarities of the dehumanizing techniques used not only in Nazi propaganda, but also in modern hate speech on social media platforms. It should first be mentioned that in Nazi Germany, its propaganda machine was perpetrated solely by the state, compared to alt-right social media, which is freely accessible to all who wish to view and or post on it. Moving forward, there are significant differences in the aspects of hate versus racism in both cases. Knowing that hate is an emotional response and a possible product of systemic racism, Nazi dehumanization towards Jews and other minorities was a direct result of racist government policies like the Nuremberg Laws. What alt-right social media platforms lack are such racist policies, and then rather portray dehumanizing and hateful rhetoric in correspondence to offline events like protests and elections. These groups also express dehumanizing rhetoric towards themes like crime, victimization, and a failing state. Nonetheless, hate speech within these groups primarily target Jews, followed by black people, and then political opponents. In looking at some of those common narratives in both Nazi Germany and alt-right social media groups, it is clear that while the Nazis portrayed Jews as a direct threat to their ideal Aryan utopia, most alt-right groups call for exclusionary policies and violence directed at immigrants, blacks, Jews, and political opponents alike. Whether consumed directly or indirectly, Nazi propaganda reached a point of radicalization where the public was either in support of the regime or indifferent to its actions. Similarly, online alt-right groups utilize social media due to its ease of radicalizing and facilitating recruitment among new users. In total, this study brought numerous interesting details to light, but what was most prominent was that in online alt-right communities, hate speech in reference to specific events were based almost entirely on false information. This pointed out a significant difference between the two cases. Considering that the Nazis had full ownership and control over the media, they could falsify and augment information with impunity, unlike the United States, where the press can hold the government accountable and report on events of their choosing. This brings us to the objectives of both cases, where, in summary, the Nazis dehumanized Jews and other minorities to scapegoat them as a cause for blame and justify the actions of the regime, compared to alt-right groups who go online to engage in the construction and affirmation of embodied racial identities. By doing so, online alt-right groups on social media become shaped by power relations which attribute to societal biases, a driver of hatred. In both cases, however, I conclude that the dehumanization and vilification of certain groups sows division in a society and fosters environments that only widen the gaps between them and expose their differences. This division creates opportunities, one that political figures can use to garner support by roping in a greater online following, and another financial incentive, achieved by spreading conspiracy theories to attract more listeners who align with the alt-right online community. During the Nazis' time, division led to easy scapegoating that put blame on minorities to further the regime's aspirations and ultimately the Holocaust. Such comparisons, as I have mentioned, can definitely instill fear, and many voice concerns that social media is a threat to democracy. It is important to remember here the role of the Nazi state in perpetrating systematic racism, which consequently led to dehumanization and hatred. The United States suffered the same fate during the time of the Jim Crow laws, but the rights for the press to keep the government accountable and to release information of their choosing is protected in the United States Constitution. Not to mention, social media is freely accessible, and radical ideologies in the alt-right dimensions can be rivaled by other users, if not the moderators. While this study does not fully delve into why these radical ideas continue to persist, it takes a step in that direction, which highlights the key similarities and differences. In future research, it could be crucial to look at how censorship may affect these online alt-right groups and/or the impact on the groups that they target.